Many problems remained unresolved, simply accumulating. He could only remember these issues for the future. He needed to focus on what he could do at this moment. Jinchi was surprised by the crackling of charcoal. When he looked outside, he saw the world had turned white with snow. It was getting chilly. He picked his robe up from the couch and slipped it on. A metallic tinkling came from the entrance. The building was designed so that it could be heard from almost anywhere. Jinchi knew who it likely was. As he had expected, his aide entered the room with his perpetually furrowed brow. "She's safely back," Gaeshun said. "Sorry to put you to such trouble all the time." Jinchi had instructed Gaeshun to see Maomao back whenever the hour got late. She had hurt her leg while saving Jinchi. He worried that if he left her alone, the wound would open again. That was not his only concern, however. There was also Lakan, who was quite eccentric. Jinchi believed the man was telling the truth about being Maomao's father. However, Maomao's attitude showed their relationship was not a typical one. Most people in the palace agreed you could never be certain what Lakan might do. Jinchi preferred to be cautious. Lakan had also been involved in Maomao reaching the altar during the ritual. The soldier who had struck her was probably regretting his actions now. One of Jinchi's best qualities was that, unlike some others at court, Gaeshun could read him well. He knew when to leave Jinchi alone to do his work. This man had been Jinchi's tutor almost from the time he was weaned. Except for a short period when Gaeshun was assigned other work, he was certainly one of the people who knew Jinchi best. When Jinchi thought about the fact that Gaeshun's wife had been his wet nurse, he realized he might never repay his debt to this man. "We will be at the rear palace tomorrow." "Yes, sir." Gaeshun brought out 2 bowls and a pot. The pot contained a sickly sweet liquid. They had to drink it every day for it to have its full effect. Gaeshun poured the contents of the pot into the 2 silver bowls, and then he took the first sip. Maomao might have eagerly taken on the role, but there was no point in her tasting it. The substance had no effect on women. Gaeshun frowned even more deeply as he drank it. Then he waited a few moments. "I think it is all right." Nothing unusual except the flavor was always unusual. The mixture contained a powdered variety of potato imported from another land. This potato had a very particular side effect. The potato flour was just one of several ingredients Jinchi and Gaeshun had to take on a daily basis. Very well. Jinchi picked up his bowl, pinched his nose, and drained it in a single long gulp. He wiped flecks of the liquid from his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he accepted a cup of cold water from Suhin. He had been drinking this stuff for 5 years, and he still had not gotten used to it. "You shouldn't hold your nose like that when people are watching," Suhin said. "I know that. It makes you look like such a little boy when you do, I know that." Jinchi sat down on the couch pouting. He had to constantly pay attention to his tone of voice, the way he spoke, and the way he walked and moved. The eunuch Jinchi was 24 years of age. He straightened up, striving to put on his best official face. However, the taste of the medicine still lingered in his mouth, making his lip curl. Gaeshun frowned. "You do not need to drink it, sir, if you dislike it so much. This is what makes me who I am as a eunuch." It had been 5 years since the current emperor took over the rear palace. 5 years, now nearly 6, that Jinchi had continued to wear this twisted mask. Year after year, he took the medicine that made him less of a man. He continued to do so even though the emperor had told him he could do as he wished with the lower-ranked consorts and any ladies less prestigious than they. Gaeshun touched a hand to the furrows in his brow. "If you do this long enough, you will never regain function." Jinchi spat out his water at that. He put his hand to his mouth and looked at Gaeshun with reproach. Gaeshun looked back at him, as if to communicate that he would have his say every now and then. "Well, the same is true of you," Jinchi said. "Not so. Just last month a grandchild was born to me." Gaeshun seemed to be saying that his children were already grown. He had no need to produce more offspring. "How old are you again?" 37. If Jinchi had his facts straight, Gaeshun had married at 16. The couple had then had 1 child each year for the next 3 years. Jinchi had milk brothers, and he was especially close with Gaeshun's youngest son. The lad had been helpful just recently, during the food poisoning involving the seaweed. He was the young man who accompanied Maomao to the official's house. "Which of the 2 elder brothers is it?" "My eldest son." and I believe my youngest son should find a wife soon. He is only 19 years old. Yes, just the same age as you, my lord. Gaeshun specifically avoided using the name Jinchi. Jinchi is a 24-year-old man who became a eunuch 5 years ago. He could not possibly be 19. Gaeshun clearly thought he was making some sort of point, Jinchi observed. Maybe he felt Jinchi should hurry up and get himself some female companions as the emperor had done. Jinchi crossed his legs and looked at Gaeshun as innocently as he could. I want to hold my grandchild. Soon, he seemed to be saying, let's finish this assignment quickly. I'll see what I can do. Gaeshun accepted some hot tea from Suhen and took a sip. Jinchi, ignoring his aide's baleful look, drank the rest of his water. Another routine round of visits to the emperor's ladies had gone without a hitch. Consort Lulan appeared to be integrating into the rear palace without difficulty. Bringing her in had been somewhat forceful, so it would not have been surprising if her presence had caused discord. However, neither Consort Jayakao nor Consort Lihua were short-tempered enough to let the new girl bother them. Yes, there had been a disagreement between the two of them after their children were born. However, that had been unusual. Since then, they had maintained a distant but friendly relationship. Consort Lishu was quite reserved, so she was unlikely to start any fights. It was always possible her ladies-in-waiting could goad her into it, so he would have to keep an eye on the situation. The residence of the former Consort R duo had become a sorry sight under its new occupant. Under the old mistress, there had not been a frivolous furnishing to be seen. But now that the new one had moved in, the pavilion had become an eye-watering riot of ostentatious displays. Consort Lulan's father was a man of whom the former emperor, or rather, more precisely, the former Empress Dowager had been quite fond. It was under him that the number of palace women had ballooned to fully 3,000. At present, Consort Jayukai was foremost in His Majesty's affections, and Consort Lihua next. But as ruler, he could not limit his nocturnal visits only to those concubines he most favoured. If the rear palace helped maintain the balance of power within the imperial court, it could also upset that balance. The emperor could not afford to mishandle Lulan, and Jinchi was given to understand, taking care to visit her at least once every 10 days. This could not but dismay the other consorts. Yes, His Majesty visited them more often than Lulan. However, no one knew who would have a child and when. Compatibility did matter, and it was clear that Lulan did not excite the emperor as much as some of his other ladies. Looking at her, Jinchi thought he could understand why. When the apothecary's daughter had given her a lesson, Lulan wore a rather unexpected accessory. It was an outlandish ornament featuring the plumes of a bird from the southern lands. Sometimes Lulan dressed in the style of the southern lands, but at other times she wore an outfit from the northern tribes. She had barely put on clothes from the east when she exchanged them for a dress from the west. Each time, her hair and makeup changed to match her outfit. This was enough to make the emperor feel as though he were seeing a different person with every visit. He said it was hard to get in the mood under those circumstances. Consort Lishu was another challenge to his mood, but for different reasons. The emperor strongly disliked his father's preferences. He refused to touch or even share a bed with a girl who still looked like a child. The Empress Dowager had a large scar on her belly. She had given birth to His present Majesty when she was very young, and her body was too small for the task. The birth canal was too narrow for a natural delivery. The child was born after the mother was carefully opened. It was not certain the mother would survive the delivery, but both she and her child were safe. The surgery appeared to have been performed by a doctor who had recently returned from other lands. His skill was truly exceptional. Even though she was scarred, the Empress Dowager could still bear children. More than 10 years later, she conceived and gave birth again. These were the only children the former emperor ever had throughout his life. However, there was a complication. The physician who had attended the Empress Dowager's first delivery, when she was a consort, found himself attending almost exclusively on Her Majesty. This was precisely because of his actions during that first difficult delivery. A child born to the Crown Prince's consort at the same time was neglected, with tragic consequences. How could Jinchi not wonder what things might be like now if the current emperor's first child had lived? He shook his head. There was nothing to gain from meaningless fantasies. He also believed His Majesty should quickly focus on producing a new crown prince. He and Gaoshan agreed on this point. Following the lecture, the emperor's visits increased considerably. The results of Maomao's work could arrive quicker than she thought. During Jinqi's visit, consort Jiukaiu's chief lady-in-waiting, Hongyang, told him something with concern. The emperor had visited the Jade Pavilion again the day before. Her mistress was looking quite tired, and Hongyang worried about her. The lady-in-waiting's disheveled jet-black hair showed how hard she was working. Gaoshan seemed to understand her efforts. Hongyang did not seem averse to Gaoshan at all. However, he already had a wife who looked after him and sometimes henpecked him, as necessary. They would have to discourage her interest sooner or later. All of this led Jinqi to believe he had the perfect solution. Jiukaiu agreed without a second thought. Hongyang looked put upon, but she quietly seemed to welcome the idea. She said as much to the three ladies in waiting who had been eavesdropping at the door. It seemed Jinqi had made the right choice. The rear palace, sir. That's right. Back to your favorite job. Maomao was polishing a silver eating vessel until it shone like a mirror. She was certain it didn't have so much as a smudge on it, and then she put it back on the shelf. Her leg still wasn't quite better, so she did a lot of her work sitting in a chair, but Suhin made sure that she did have work to do. That woman was a real stickler. Jinqi was eating a tangerine. He wasn't even peeling it himself, quite literally. Suhin did that, carefully removing the thin rind. She set each piece on a plate in front of him. What a spoiled brat he was. The old attendant seemed to have a habit of indulging Jinqi. She would wrap him in a cotton jacket when it was cold, and she would cool down his tea because it was hot. An adult man should have been embarrassed to be treated that way. It would appear consort Jiukaiu has ceased to walk the path of the moon. The path of the moon was a polite term for menstruation. So she might be pregnant, Maomao thought. 2 separate attempts had been made to poison the consort while she was pregnant with Princess Lingli. The culprit had never been found. Maomao could understand why Jinqi might be uneasy. And when am I to begin my new assignment? Would today be possible? Possible. I would certainly prefer it. Men were not allowed in the rear palace. She would be free of any possibility of bumping into the one person she didn't want to meet. She didn't even want to hear that person's name. Perhaps Jinqi had arranged this change of workplace out of consideration for her, or perhaps it was simply an opportune coincidence for him. Maomao decided she didn't care which. She thought she was exercising admirable self-restraint, but then Suhin said, good news, my dear. Apparently Maomao wasn't hiding it as well as she thought. Not to speak of, she said, too bad for me. I thought I'd finally found a prot-G worthy of my training. Maomao, a touch terrified by the grinning Suhin, determined to finish her work as quickly as she could. Chapter 15, Rear Palace Redux. I used to think I didn't like this place, but I guess I was wrong, Maomao thought with surprise. She was finding life in the rear palace quite congenial now that she was finally back. She had grown up in another place full of women, so perhaps the rear palace simply clicked with her. Her days once again consisted of tasting food, mixing medicines, and taking little walks. Her leg still wasn't healed. She had been given explicit instructions not to go out too much. However, in her opinion she was fine, so long as she avoided anything strenuous that might open the wound again. Frankly, her left arm proved she was nowhere near so delicate. The question of Jiukaiu's pregnancy still wasn't definitively settled. When she was pregnant with Princess Lingli, she did not suffer from severe morning sickness, and her food preferences hardly changed. Aside from the delay in her menstruation, there was no clear evidence either way. However, a gag order was imposed on the Jade Pavilion, just in case. Anyone who didn't want consort Jiukaiu to become pregnant would want to act quickly. The early stages of pregnancy were the most vulnerable. Poison was only one of many concerns. As a precaution, the emperor was discouraged from his nighttime visits to the Jade Pavilion for a while. Usually this wouldn't have been a problem. However, since consort Jiukaiu had started using what she learned at the consort's seminar, things no longer seemed normal. It was hard to say what might happen next. Perhaps I should have been a little gentler with the lessons, Maomao thought. But no, then Jiukaiu and even the emperor would have been dissatisfied. Her approach had resulted in terrifying consort Lishu and causing consort Lihua's women to view Maomao as a monster. Naturally, Maomao hesitated to raise the subject with the emperor herself. It was hardly something for a maid to bring up with His Majesty, so she communicated through Jinchi instead. She couldn't quite state her wish directly, but she hoped the ruler would continue to visit Gyokaiu with the same frequency as before. It was important that he visit no more and no less. After all, Gyokaiu was His Majesty's only consort. If he were to suddenly visit her less often, someone perceptive might discover the truth. To her surprise, the emperor continued to visit as faithfully as ever. He played with his adorable daughter and passed the time in idle conversation with Gyokaiu. Maomao remembered, as she had with Arju's story, that perhaps she shouldn't dismiss the emperor as simply sex-crazed. Or maybe His Majesty grasped the implications of his actions better than she gave him credit for. Some people regarded the current ruler as a sort of sage king, while some of this was because almost anyone would have looked competent after the buffoon that the previous emperor had been. Maomao did believe that the current ruler had his wits about him. It does not really matter to me, she thought. She was happy as long as he allowed life to continue and did not impose excessive taxes. Some people said the difference between a foolish ruler and a brilliant ruler was this. A foolish ruler believed the people were inexhaustible. A brilliant ruler realized they had their limits. If that was true, then the current emperor was definitely that type. However, she noticed the sad expressions he sometimes made. Because of this, she decided to give him the rest of her teaching materials. They would help him pass the time at the very least. It doesn't need to be said exactly what kind of teaching materials they were. She had made sure to have a number of different books on hand, just in case. Unfortunately, none of the ladies in waiting had been interested in them. He will just have to make do with 2 dimensions. Maomao placed the materials where they would be unobtrusive yet noticeable. Luckily, it seemed he spotted them. A few days later, when she was ordered to prepare more such materials, she decided that perhaps sex-crazed was the right way to describe him after all. There was a penchant for rumor-mongering in the rear palace, most likely attributable to the boredom generated by the endless routine and the perennial shortage of the opposite sex. So when the ladies in waiting did not have much to do, they found themselves chatting in the kitchen. They had the cast-offs from the latest tea party for snacks. Today it was longsutang, dragon's beard candy, a treat made of delicate fibers that melted in the mouth. This one had tea leaves mixed in, giving it a faint aroma. I couldn't believe that outfit, could you? Yinghua, one of the Jade Pavilion's ladies in waiting, said around a mouthful of candy. She was a self-possessed woman, more than willing to say what she thought. It is true, but the thing she wore a little while ago, I thought that was nice. Western clothing is so cool, isn't it? Gyuan said in a mild tone. She was smiling, happy to be enjoying a sweet treat. Ailan observed, clothes like that choose their own wearers. She continued, but hers have never looked bad on her. The lanky lady in waiting was not big on sweets and was simply sipping some tea at the moment. Yinghua, looking wounded by her friend's faithlessness, turned to her last refuge, Maomao. Yeah, sure, Maomao said, nodding. She privately thought how she hated to get dragged into these spats. That was as far as her engagement in the conversation went. Yinghua, disappointed her hopes of reinforcement weren't met, puffed out her cheeks. Well, I thought Consort Ardua was much cooler. She took an angry sip of tea without pulling her cheeks back in. Gyuan and Ailan grinned at each other. Well, it turns out you were on Team Ardu all this time, Yinghua. I was not, Yinghua exclaimed. Ailan just smirked. You don't have to hide it. I know we serve Lady Gyokaiu, but no one would blame you for feeling the way you do. I don't feel that way. Maomao listened to the girl's chatter as she drank the rest of her tea. She much preferred savory treats. The cotton candy was too sweet for her. She would have loved some salty rice crackers to refresh her palate. As for who Yinghua and the other girls were talking about, it was the newly arrived consort Lulan. She possessed one unusual quality, more than enough to inspire conversation. What was this quality? Her clothes. Almost every time she appeared, she wore an outfit with a different personality. One day she might be in a Western dress. The next, she would be outfitted like a rider from one of the tribes. I wonder what the story is, Maomao thought. Perhaps she simply had too much money. If she continued changing outfits at that rate, her pavilion would soon be filled with clothing. The once austere Garnet Pavilion had already changed beyond recognition. It seemed as though the new resident intended to banish the spirit of Arduo. It was both a fitting and an unfitting thing to do. The rear palace was a place where people advanced by standing out. However, the saying went that the nail that stuck up would be pounded down. Lulan might have been such a nail in normal circumstances, but her father had been an important advisor during the former emperor's reign. Therefore, there was no hammer big enough to subdue her. That explains a lot, Maomao thought. That was certainly enough reason to send Arju away. Given Lulan's age, it might have even seemed a little late. Then Maomao considered something. Perhaps it would have been more convenient for the emperor if Arju had stayed in the rear palace. She could not be a mother of the country, so her eyes were fixed straight ahead. She was so perceptive and intelligent that one might wish she had been born a man. Now, with one decision, the emperor had lost an excellent advisor. He had gained a young woman who might influence not only the rear palace but the greater court as well.